Good day everyone, Londononion here with a boatload of allergies, continuing our Summoner Prime builds fitting for the Apocalypse difficulty. As for our accompanying archetype, this time I choose to assign the Challenger. The Challenger and Summoner are not an intuitive pair in this Onion's opinion. Their perks and skills don't have much natural synergy. The Summoner is more oriented to standing back and letting their summons do their bidding. Meanwhile, the Challenger is oriented to close-range combat with a higher advantage in use of melee weapons. Their archetype traits are helpful and effectively similar to the Ruthless Mastermind. They can both inadvertently achieve a similar goal, but in a different way. Regrowth is to recovery, as Strongback is to sustaining heavier armor, which in turn correlates with increased damage reduction. Despite their main differences, their practical use is the key here. And to start us off, we'll transition to the build. Starting off with the armor, I employ the Loadout Mark II armor set. The relic is a preferential choice, but I favor either the Crystal Heart or the Runed Heart. As for the shards, I go with Mythic Healing Effectiveness, Mythic Armor Effectiveness, and Mythic Charge Melee Cost. Healing Effectiveness will synergize with the Summoner's Regrowth perk. Armor Effectiveness will buff armor to 203.3 units, and Charged Melee Cost will add with how we intend to use this build. Moving on to the weapons, I favor the Chicago Typewriter with Healing Shot and Maximized Fetid Wounds. The primary effect is inconsequential. The maximized effect is what counts, as weak spot or critical hits apply Corroded for 10 seconds. The secondary I employ is Nebula. The mutator is really up to one's preference, but I would go with either Feedback or Maximized Twisting Wounds, which applies bleeding after weak spot or critical damage. Bleeding targets will also receive 20% increased damage by this weapon. Lastly, the melee weapon was a toss-up for me, but this Onion has a slight favor for the Gas Giant with Maximized Tainted Blade. Melee damage is increased by 10% for every stack of Corroded, and charged melee attacks apply corrosive damage for 10 seconds. The mod on this weapon, Dying Breath, upon infusion will leave an acid cloud for 15 seconds following a neutral evade charged melee attack. Moving on to the accessories, the amulet leading this build is the Effluvium Enhancer. This will increase acid damage by 20% and corrosive damage by 50%. Our first ring is Hardcore Band, which grants a stack of Bulwark for 10 seconds every time one receives damage. Next, Dried Clay Ring grants a stack of Bulwark and increases all damage by 60% of the total damage reduction granted by Bulwark. Following, Dying Ember grants 6% of melee damage as lifesteal. The last ring slot can be played with based on preference, but I favor the Red Ring of Death, which duplicates the last negative status effect applied to a given target, but reduces outgoing status effect damage by 10%. With most of the build determined, we will move on to the skills, traits, and build application. So the minion I favor for this pairing is the Reaver. For the Challenger, I employ Juggernaut. The Reaver is an almost perfect mixture of the grounded and airborne hollows and flyers respectively. The Reaver's main limitations are that only one can be summoned. They have the longest cooldown time, and they are rather slow. Their speed, however, can be increased by activating Enrage, the prime perk of the Summoner. Upon activation, the Reaver will instead run with the Summoner and toward enemies they target. I actually find it rather impressive. Juggernaut grants 3 stacks of Bulwark, a 15% increase in movement speed, melee speed, and reduced stamina cost. Melee damage is also increased by 50% and stagger is reduced by 1 unit. The traits I employ are the Handler's Kinship, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Arcane Strike, Barkskin, Rugged, and Siphoner. Now, the practical application of this pairing and the build is important to explore. Of course, there is a strong edge in acid/corrosive damage, but that is not the entire picture. Corrosive damage is not only a means of inflicting damage over time, but also enhancing oneself and the Reaver sidekick, but taking it from the ground up. The Chicago Typewriter is not a particularly hard-hitting weapon, but fast and lengthy. The ammo economy, however, is terrible. With Fetid Wounds, Effluvium Enhancer, and Red Ring of Death, a single critical shot or weak spot hit will eliminate most, if not all, common enemies with the damage over time. More practically, Burst Fire is highly recommended. This would naturally translate to minimal ammo expenditure, but also easy activation of corrosive damage due to the typewriter speed and ease of use. Nebula is similar, but is more oriented to close-range combat and managing numerous foes that don't respect personal space. I also use Nebula to enrage the Reaver. They will have a stack of Corroded applied for 15 seconds, and maintain their enraged state for the duration. Once this expires, their enraged countdown will begin. This essentially tacks on an additional 15 seconds of an enraged Reaver. Kinship and Rugged prevent the damage from being too significant. Given the Reaver's lengthy cooldown time, Healing Shot is intended to be an answer for their accumulated damage and keeping them alive. Another avenue to enraging the Reaver is with the Gas Giant, with the neutral evade charged gas cloud. With the Challenger as the secondary archetype, melee use will be a part of the offensive strategy. With Dying Ember, one's Juggernaut skill, and the Reaver to fight by your side, one's survivability increases, but I would consider melee use to be a secondary offensive method. The Reaver is disposable, you are not, and naturally have some limitations in protection. After all, I would not call this a full-on melee build, but rather use melee as a supplement. However, the Gas Giant Acid Cloud will also add Corroded to the user after the 5-second immunity time expires. Due to Kinship, Regrowth, and the resistances of the armor set, the damage is completely negated, and one will heal right through it, even if they have sustained previous damage. So there really is no danger to having the Acid Cloud affect the user. Now, because of Hardcore Band and Dried Clay Ring, the constant corrosive damage will immediately maximize one's bulwark stacks and increase all damage, including the Reaver, by 15%. And if one wants to go further, they can enrage the Reaver, maximize bulwark stacks, and use a relic for an even greater output in damage. The only downside to being corroded is that one's damage sensitivity will increase by 10%. So while exploring, I typically keep the Reaver in an enraged state, using either weapon, but preferably Nebula for the guaranteed 15-second bonus. Through combat, Healing Shot will be replenished with relative ease, or a relic can be used in the event of an emergency. And this is partially why I favor Ruined Heart. In the event that one has to use a relic, Healing Shot will very quickly be replenished. But continuing on, weak enemies are given a few rounds and finished off with the corrosive damage. Otherwise, Gas Giant if they should get too close. Tough enemies naturally will take more time, but don't last long with melee combat. Environmental objects can be used to boost the infuse effect and used for a later time. One can even activate the Gas Cloud strictly to get their bulwark stacks up and increase the efficacy of the Reaver from a distance. Additionally, one can even stand in the cloud and maintain their corroded stacks for an extended period of time, allowing their bulwark to last even longer. In the event of crowds, Nanoswarm is quite useful, especially if overwhelmed. One will simply have to evade while the nanobots eat away at your enemies. If fighting side by side with the Reaver, Healing Shot is effective for both parties due to its splash effect, and any damage taken will only make you tougher. The main downfall of this class is coming across acid-resistant enemies/bosses. Acid, after all, is the main tool, and this is partially why I chose to employ Twisting Wounds on Nebula. It's not much of a compensation, but it is something, and the bleeding can be enhanced with the Red Ring of Death. Numerous ranged and airborne targets will likely prove difficult for the Reaver to keep up with, and this will require greater support from the caster, but most other foes are fair game. I like to relate the dynamic of this build to the two-dimensional Kirby games of old, though I would consider this relationship to be more on the toxic side. Now, I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses, based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, And I've got to go blow my nose. And I'll see you guys next time.